The night air was heavy with silence, broken only by the distant hum of engines and the crunch of boots on gravel. A soldier's life is often defined by routine, marching, patrolling, following orders with mechanical precision. But every so often, in the stillness of the battlefield, something slips through the cracks of reality itself. It begins quietly, like a shadow moving against the wind, like a voice whispered from nowhere, and in those moments, men trained to face bullets and bombs find themselves frozen by something far more terrifying, something science refuses to explain. This is War Files Uncovered, and tonight, we pull back the curtain on the story soldiers carry in silence. If you're ready to step into the darkness where military records end and the unexplainable begins, stay with us, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel for the untold stories history tried to bury. It was 3:42 a.m. on a forgotten border outpost in Eastern Europe, winter of 1983. The Cold War was at its peak, paranoia dripping through the veins of every soldier stationed along the line of iron and snow. A platoon of young conscripts patrolled the perimeter, their rifles heavy in the frost-bitten air, their breaths forming ghosts in the darkness. They were trained to expect infiltrators, saboteurs, maybe even a Soviet tank rolling through the forest. But no training manual had prepared them for what they were about to face. Private Anton Kovacs, barely 19, swore that he first heard it. A strange humming vibration, low and metallic, resonating through the earth beneath his boots. It wasn't the sound of machinery, not the rumble of an approaching vehicle. It was something else, something alive, vibrating through bone and marrow. The men turned their flashlights into the tree line, expecting the reflection of enemy eyes. But instead, the forest seemed to ripple, as if the very air had become water. Branches shimmered, shapes bent unnaturally, and within that distortion, Anton claimed he saw figures, tall, faceless silhouettes standing perfectly still, watching. His commander barked orders, believing the men were panicking over nothing, but then the radios crackled with a burst of static so violent it pierced eardrums, followed by voices speaking in languages none of them recognized. A sergeant dropped to his knees, clutching his head as if the sound was drilling into his skull. The platoon opened fire into the trees. Bullets tore through bark, snow erupted in clouds, but the figures didn't move, didn't fall. They simply faded, like smoke dissipating in the night. When dawn broke, the forest was empty, but the snow was marked by impressions, deep indentations where no boots had walked, no animal had strayed. The commanding officer ordered silence, told the men to write nothing in their logs. Yet the memory clung to them, a scar etched deeper than any battlefield wound. Some of those soldiers never spoke again of that night. Others claimed the humming followed them even in their sleep. Years later, across the world in the humid jungles of Vietnam, another squad would encounter something disturbingly similar. It was July 1968, and the air hung thick with insects and sweat. American troops advanced cautiously through the darkness, their ears sharpened to every crack of twig and hiss of wind. They were looking for Viet Cong tunnels, but what they found instead has haunted veterans for decades. At 2:17 a.m., Private William Harlan described the jungle as suddenly falling silent. No frogs, no crickets, no birds. Just silence. Then, from the canopy above, a pale blue light descended, illuminating the undergrowth in an otherworldly glow. The men froze, rifles raised, but the light didn't move like a flare or a helicopter beam. It hovered, pulsating like a living thing. Within it, they claimed, were shapes, human but elongated, limbs too thin, movements too fluid to belong to anything natural. The squad leader shouted for everyone to hold fire, but panic overcame discipline. A burst of machine gun fire ripped through the night, and in that chaos the light blinked out instantly, plunging the jungle into blackness. The only sound was the soldiers' ragged breathing and the pounding of their hearts. But when their eyes adjusted, they noticed something horrifying. Every leaf, every branch around them was scorched, not burned by flame, but blackened as though life itself had been drained from it. Within that circle of devastation, the soldiers swore they could still smell ozone, as if lightning had struck, though the skies above were perfectly clear. Military records of that night mention nothing beyond hostile contact, but privately, the men carried a different truth. They said their dreams were never the same. Some awoke screaming, swearing the blue light had returned to their bedrooms. Others reported waking up outside their barracks with no memory of how they got there. To this day, veterans who were there speak of it in hushed tones, their voices breaking as though even describing it might bring it back. These encounters were not isolated. From the frozen ridges of Afghanistan to the deserts of Iraq, soldiers have recorded moments where war itself seemed to pause, as if the battlefield was being watched by something beyond human comprehension. One Marine in Fallujah swore that during a firefight, he saw a figure walking calmly through the chaos, untouched by bullets or fire, its face hidden beneath a hood of shadow. When he blinked, it was gone, leaving only the smell of sulfur in the air. What makes these stories so haunting is not their rarity but their consistency. Across different eras in different countries, among soldiers who never knew each other, the patterns repeat. Humming vibrations, faceless figures, unearthly lights, silence in places where nature should be alive. And yet, the official records stay quiet. Commanders dismiss them as stress, exhaustion, hallucination. But the men who were there insist otherwise. These were not illusions. They were real. They left marks on the ground, burns on the trees, scars in the minds of the toughest men war has ever made. And so, hidden in the margins of history, a secret folklore of the military is born. Whispers traded over campfires, confessions muttered years later in veterans' halls, the kind of stories no one dares to put in official reports, yet they persist. Because once you've stood in the dark and felt something watching you, once you've seen shadows move against the laws of nature, you can never truly return to the comfort of disbelief. The outpost where Anton Kovacs once stood has long since crumbled into dust and memory, yet whispers of that night continue to ripple through forgotten military circles. His letters, never meant for official eyes, describe in trembling handwriting how the humming sound carried into his bones long after he returned home. He wrote of nights where the glass on his bedroom windows would rattle without wind, where shadows in the hallway seemed to pause when he passed by. His mother once found him standing barefoot in the snow, shivering and repeating the same words over and over in a language she could not recognize. When pressed, Anton denied it, claiming she must have dreamed it. But the neighbors remembered. They heard it too. Half a world away, in the blistering deserts of North Africa during the Second World War, another account eerily mirrors Anton's experience. It was 1942, under the relentless sun of El Alamein, where British patrol units spent endless days scouring the sand for enemy convoys. Corporal James Ellery had already survived tank ambushes and air raids, but what he saw in the shifting dunes one night unsettled him more than the war itself. Just after midnight, as the horizon shimmered under the moonlight, Ellery reported seeing shapes moving across the sand, not enemy troops, but columns of figures marching in total silence. They were translucent, their outlines glowing faintly in the desert haze. His first thought was that heat mirages had tricked him, but when the figures passed through a ridge, leaving footprints in the sand behind them, his blood turned to ice. The patrol froze, watching in disbelief as the ghostly column continued, their movements eerily synchronized, faces obscured by shadows. When Ellery finally blinked, the figures had vanished, leaving only the disturbed sand as proof. In his diary, smudged with sweat and grit, he wrote, "We fought men of flesh and steel today. But at night we are stalked by something else. Something older than this desert." The entry was never included in the official reports. It remained buried in his family's attic until decades later, when his grandson uncovered it, still unwilling to share it publicly for fear of ridicule. By the late 20th century, these stories became impossible to ignore. In 1980, at a remote Soviet base in the Ural Mountains, radar operators reported a sudden spike, an object hovering above their installation at impossible speeds. Troops scrambled outside to confirm visual contact. They described a sphere of fire suspended in the sky, brighter than any aircraft flare, shifting colors from crimson to pure white. Then, just as suddenly, it fractured into 3 smaller orbs, each darting in different directions before converging again in complete silence. The event lasted only 43 seconds, yet every instrument in the base malfunctioned simultaneously. Radio communications dissolved into incomprehensible static, power grids flickered out, and compasses spun wildly. Afterward, engineers scoured the area, finding no evidence of intrusion. But the soldiers present that night swore they felt watched, as though an invisible eye followed their every movement. One officer confided years later that when he closed his eyes that night, he could still see the orb imprinted on the back of his eyelids, burning with a light that felt alive. Veterans of Afghanistan in the 1980s told similar stories. A Soviet infantry unit camped deep in the mountains reported strange voices echoing through the ravines at night, voices that repeated the soldiers' own words back to them seconds after they spoke. At first, they believed the enemy was playing tricks, psychological warfare meant to rattle their nerves. But when the voices began to mimic not just speech but laughter, sobbing, and even the cries of fallen comrades long dead, the men realized something far stranger was at work. One soldier, pale and trembling, swore he saw his dead brother standing on a ridge, motionless, staring down at him. When the others looked, there was nothing there. But that night, every man in the unit dreamed the same dream, walking down an endless tunnel where light flickered like fire at the far end, only to wake with nosebleeds staining their pillows. The Americans too had their share. In Iraq, 2005, at a checkpoint outside Mosul, 3 Marines reported seeing a woman in a white dress walking slowly along the roadside at 2:11 a.m. She appeared on thermal cameras but not on night vision scopes, and when one Marine attempted to approach, she vanished mid-step. Minutes later, a roadside IED detonated in the same location where she had stood, though no trigger wires or tracks were ever found. The Marines later swore the woman's face was blurred, as though they were looking through water. Locals, when asked, told them not to speak of her, calling her Am-Al-Ru, the mother of souls, a figure known to wander battlefields where the dead linger. What binds these stories together is not just their strangeness, but their universality. Soldiers from opposite sides of history, Axis and allies, Soviets and Americans, conscripts and volunteers, all describe the same phenomena: faceless watchers, lights that defy physics, voices that mimic the living and the dead. 4 men trained to survive ambushes and artillery, these encounters are far more terrifying because they cannot be explained, cannot be fought, cannot be killed. By 1979, whispers began circulating of a secret NATO file labeled simply Phantom Reports. Allegedly compiled from decades of classified testimonies, the file contained hundreds of accounts scrubbed from official logs but preserved by intelligence officers unwilling to dismiss them as hallucinations. Those who claim to have seen fragments of the file describe recurring phrases: non-terrestrial interference, temporal anomalies, collective hallucination, unverified. To this day, no such file has surfaced publicly, but the stories continue to multiply. And perhaps the most chilling truth is this: wars end, borders shift, regimes collapse, but the stories remain the same. In every conflict, in every era, soldiers glimpse something just beyond the veil, something that stares back from the dark. Whether these forces are remnants of the dead, unknown visitors from beyond, or fractures in the fabric of reality itself, one thing is undeniable. The battlefield, already haunted by human suffering, becomes a stage for encounters that no human mind can fully comprehend. The human mind clings to reason like a lifeline, especially in war zones where logic is the only thing separating survival from madness. Orders are followed, protocols are rehearsed, every sound cataloged and explained. But what happens when the explanations dissolve? When the training manuals fall silent? Soldiers, hardened by fire and steel, are left with no armor against the impossible. And it is in these cracks of human understanding that the strangest stories of all emerge. It was January 7, 2005, in the icy hills outside Kandahar. A small American reconnaissance team set up camp at the ruins of an abandoned Soviet outpost, its concrete walls riddled with bullet scars, graffiti still scrawled in Cyrillic. Night fell early, swallowing the valley in a silence broken only by the whistling wind. The men gathered around their dimmed lamps, laughing nervously at the thought of Soviet ghosts haunting the place. But laughter turned to unease when Private Andrew Mitchell noticed movement near the shattered perimeter wall. Through his night scope, he saw a lone figure walking in perfect stride toward their camp. He called out. No answer. The figure grew closer. Orders were given to raise weapons. But as the silhouette stepped into range, every man froze. The figure was dressed not in Afghan attire, nor in the modern camouflage of coalition troops, but in the faded uniform of a Soviet soldier from another era. His helmet was cracked, his face bloodied, his eyes empty voids. The apparition stopped just meters away and stood motionless, as though waiting for something. Then, in a voice rasping like sand against stone, it muttered a phrase in Russian before collapsing into the dust. When the men rushed forward, nothing remained. No body. No tracks. Only the echo of foreign words still ringing in their ears. Later, a translator revealed the phrase, "Hold the line." The same words, according to declassified Soviet journals, that were shouted by soldiers defending the post in 1986, just before they were overrun. The Americans never spoke publicly of the incident, but in private, they admitted the encounter left them shaken more than any firefight ever had. Half a century earlier, on a frozen battlefield far from Afghanistan, another patrol had its own brush with the unexplainable. It was the winter of 1944, deep in the Ardennes during the Battle of the Bulge. A squad of American infantry huddled in a makeshift bunker as artillery thundered in the distance. At 3:12 a.m., a strange light swept across the treetops. At first they assumed it was a flare, but the light moved unnaturally, sliding in silence, bending through branches without casting shadows. As it hovered over their trench, The men reported a sudden drop in temperature, their breaths crystallizing in front of their faces. Private Thomas Carr claimed he saw figures walking inside the light, as though on a distant stage, their movements blurred yet deliberate. They carried no weapons, wore no recognizable uniforms, and seemed to communicate without sound. The light lingered for nearly a full minute before vanishing instantly, leaving the forest plunged back into darkness. The squad sat in silence for hours afterward, unable to speak. Days later, when reinforcements arrived, the men tried to explain what they had seen, but their commanding officer dismissed it as stress-induced hallucination. Yet every soldier in that trench swore under oath that what they saw was real. The deeper one dives into these accounts, the clearer a pattern emerges. The encounters often arrive in the quiet hours between battles, when fear is dormant, when men are most unguarded. A Marine in Hue City during the Vietnam War described it as the breath before violence, a stillness where time itself seemed to warp. He recounted how one evening, while patrolling the outskirts of the city, his squad heard children laughing in the ruins. They searched the collapsed houses, flashlights cutting through the dust, but found no children. The laughter grew louder, circling them until it became deafening. Then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. Minutes later, the squad walked straight into an ambush. 2 men were killed instantly. To this day, survivors insist the laughter was a warning or a lure. Perhaps the most unsettling accounts come not from soldiers in combat, but from those standing guard in the long stretches of nothingness that define military life. In 1972, aboard a British naval vessel in the North Atlantic, a watchman on the night shift reported seeing lights beneath the waves. At first he assumed it was bioluminescent plankton, but the lights moved with purpose. 3 glowing orbs darting in formation just beneath the surface. They kept pace with the ship for nearly an hour, performing impossible maneuvers, accelerating and stopping with sudden bursts. When he alerted his commanding officer, the captain arrived just in time to witness the lights vanish straight upward, breaking the surface of the water without leaving a ripple. Official records note only unexplained radar anomalies. The crew, however, spoke of nothing else for months. War is already a theater of ghosts. The dead linger in every crater, every rusted shell, every burned-out bunker. But when stories like these surface, they suggest something beyond memory, something watching, something participating in the violence of mankind's darkest hours. Soldiers return home with scars and medals, but many also return with stories they cannot tell. The sound of footsteps when no one is there, shadows stretching where light should not fall, whispers that follow them across continents. And while some dismiss these tales as the fevered hallucinations of exhausted men, too many accounts align across too many decades to be ignored. Different wars, different nations, the same descriptions, the same chilling silence, the same sense of being observed by something just beyond comprehension. The question remains, lingering like a shadow over the battlefield. Are these visions echoes of the dead, replaying their final moments, or are they something else entirely? Forces drawn to the blood and chaos of war, feeding on it, weaving themselves into its history? For the men who have seen them, it makes little difference. The encounters are real. The fear is real. And the silence they are forced to keep afterward may be the heaviest burden of all. The winter in Kandahar was brutal, the kind of cold that gnawed through body armor and turned every breath into a dagger of frost. But the cold that night, the night of the Soviet apparition, was different. Veterans later swore it was as though the air itself had been pulled out of the valley, a void pressing against their chests, leaving them lightheaded, weak. One Marine wrote in his journal that it felt like drowning without water, gasping for breath while the world stood still. The men had fought insurgents, endured sandstorms, survived roadside bombs, but none of those terrors haunted them like the soldier in the faded Soviet uniform. The strangest part wasn't his sudden disappearance. It was the way his voice carried, not like sound, but like thought itself pressed into their minds. Stories like this ripple through history, layered like scars on the flesh of war. During the Korean War in the frozen winter of 1951, a platoon of U.S. soldiers on night watch described seeing a line of lanterns weaving through the mountains. Believing it to be enemy movement, they prepared to engage, only to realize the lights floated several feet above the ground, moving too smoothly to belong to human hands. The men held fire, waiting for confirmation, but the lights drifted silently past their position, illuminating the snow in a pale green hue. When dawn arrived, they scouted the ridge and found no tracks, no evidence that anyone or anything had been there. Only the frost itself had melted in a strange serpentine pattern where the lights had passed. In the jungles of Burma, 1944, Japanese soldiers reported encounters with something eerily similar. One diary, discovered years later in a collapsed bunker, described a column of fireflies that drifted through the trees during the dead of night. The soldier wrote how the lights grew brighter and brighter until they burned his eyes, and when he awoke, he was alone in the jungle, his entire unit gone. The diary ended there. The man was never found, and the unit's disappearance was recorded as a mystery of war. But the phenomenon isn't always light. Sometimes it is sound that tears through silence like a blade. In 1991, during Operation Desert Storm, U.S. forces pushing through the Kuwaiti desert reported hearing whispers carried on the wind. Men swore the voices called their names, sometimes in English, sometimes in tongues they couldn't understand. The whispers grew louder near certain dunes, places locals avoided, claiming they were cursed burial grounds. A few soldiers reported chasing the voices, only to find themselves disoriented, wandering far from their units. One Marine vanished entirely, his footprints stretching into the desert and ending abruptly, as though he had simply been lifted away. His body was never recovered. His name remains etched on the wall of the missing, but among those who served with him, the whispers are remembered with dread. The Soviets in Afghanistan had their own whispers. In the mountains of Kunar province, a paratrooper company bivouacked inside a cavernous gorge. Night after night, they reported the sound of drums echoing faintly through the cliffs. At first, commanders dismissed it as local tribes signaling, but the sound never followed logic. It did not fade with distance. It did not change with weather. It pulsed like a heartbeat, sometimes above them, sometimes beneath their very feet. One night, several men woke screaming, their ears bleeding. They swore the drums had been inside their skulls, vibrating their bones, drowning out every thought. Yet perhaps the most unnerving of all encounters are those that blur the line between the living and the dead. In 1979, near the Cambodian border, an American helicopter crew swore they picked up a distress call over their radio. The voice belonged to a soldier identifying himself by name, rank, and unit. But when they cross-checked the details, they froze. The man had died 2 years earlier, his entire squad ambushed in the same jungle sector. The crew debated whether to investigate, fearing an enemy trap, but when they circled overhead, their instruments malfunctioned. Compasses spun wildly, gauges flatlined, and the jungle below was cloaked in an unnatural fog. By the time they landed, the radio had gone silent. The distress call was never recorded, but every man aboard swore they had heard it clear as day. What makes these accounts unbearable for those who lived them is not only the terror of the moment but the silence that follows. Commanders rarely believe. Official reports sanitize the details, reducing unexplainable encounters to equipment malfunction, enemy deception, or psychological stress. Yet the men and women who saw them know the truth, because they still wake at night, drenched in sweat, their ears ringing with voices that should not exist. A Canadian soldier stationed in Bosnia in the 1990s described it perfectly. You can train yourself to face bullets. You can train yourself to face the sight of death. But you can't train yourself for what isn't supposed to exist. When it happens, your world cracks and nothing is safe anymore. Not the day, not the night, not even your own mind. And it is that fracture, that moment when the unexplainable pierces the shield of reason, that unites all these soldiers across generations and continents. The battlefield is more than a place of blood and steel. It is a crossroads where time, memory, and something far older seem to collide. Some soldiers believe these are the ghosts of the fallen, still marching their endless patrols. Others whisper they are something else, watchers drawn to human suffering, feeding on the chaos of war. Whatever they are, one truth echoes across every testimony. Once you see them, once you hear them, you are never the same. Because the battlefield doesn't just take lives. Sometimes, it leaves behind things no war can ever explain. There is a strange truth about the battlefield. It is not only the living who patrol it. Long after the tanks roll away and the flags are lowered, the land remembers. Soldiers who have walked those scarred fields speak of echoes, shadows, and presences that refuse to leave. To the outsider, these may seem like myths told to pass the time. But to those who stood in the cold silence, to those who felt the unexplainable brush against their skin, the memory never fades. In 1916, during the slaughter at the Somme, British troops advancing through the mud of no man's land reported something that shook even their hardened commanders. Amid the constant shelling and the cries of the wounded, several men claimed to see a line of armored knights moving across the smoke-filled field. Not enemy cavalry, not soldiers. They were spectral figures in medieval armor, faces hidden, weapons raised. The men froze, certain they were hallucinating, but when the mist cleared, the ground where the knights had marched was littered with newly dead, though no shells had landed there. Survivors later whispered that they had seen the angels of Mons, apparitions sent not to protect, but to remind the living that war is endless, repeating itself across centuries. Decades later, in the jungles of Vietnam, soldiers described another echo from the past. In 1969, a U.S. patrol near Da Nang was caught in a sudden monsoon. Visibility dropped to almost nothing, rain slashing down in sheets. As they huddled under ponchos, Private Raymond Ortiz swore he saw figures moving just beyond the curtain of rain. They carried spears, their bodies lean and dark, their movements precise and silent. The squad thought it was the Viet Cong preparing an ambush, but when they fired flares, the light revealed nothing but empty jungle. Yet the footprints in the mud told a different story. Dozens of bare human tracks circled their position, too fresh, too precise to be imagined. Later, villagers spoke of ancient warriors who guarded that valley, fighters from a war centuries past who returned when blood was spilled on their land. But the phenomenon is not confined to battlefields of old. In modern conflicts, the same patterns emerge. In 2010, British troops in Helmand province reported strange disturbances inside an abandoned compound. Soldiers on night watch claimed to hear footsteps pacing the roof, though no one was there. Others heard doors creaking open and shutting, despite the fact that the doors had been blown off their hinges long before. One soldier swore that while cleaning his weapon, he looked up to see a man in Afghan robes standing silently in the doorway. He blinked and the figure was gone, but the sand at the threshold bore fresh footprints leading inward, none leading out. Perhaps the most unnerving case came from the Falklands War in 1982. A group of Argentine conscripts, freezing and malnourished, reported hearing music drifting across the barren landscape at night. Not the sound of radios or distant artillery, but orchestral music, violins, horns, drums, rising and falling as if an unseen symphony played in the darkness. The young soldiers followed the sound, desperate for warmth, only to find themselves disoriented in the fog, their compasses useless. Hours later, they stumbled back to camp, frostbitten and terrified, swearing they had walked into a hall of mirrors where lights flickered and voices whispered their names. Their commander threatened punishment if they spoke of it again, but years later, survivors admitted they still hear faint strains of that music in their dreams. What makes these stories even more chilling is how they intertwine with the fabric of history. At Gallipoli in 1915, an entire company of British soldiers famously vanished after marching into a strange, low-lying cloud. Witnesses from nearby units swore the men walked in formation straight into the mist and never emerged. When the cloud lifted, the hillside was empty. No bodies, no weapons, nothing. Official records listed them as missing in action, but locals whispered that the earth itself had swallowed them whole. Again and again, across centuries, across continents, soldiers report the same experiences. Lights that move with intelligence, sounds that defy explanation, figures that walk between the living and the dead. These are not isolated tales. They are a pattern, a hidden thread weaving through the history of war. And perhaps the most terrifying truth is this: these encounters often arrive at the edge of great violence, as though the unexplainable is drawn to human suffering. It waits in the silence before artillery, in the fog before dawn, in the breathless pause between ambush and counterattack. Soldiers call it bad luck, a curse, a sign of death to come. Commanders dismiss it. But in whispered conversations in the quiet halls of veterans' homes, the truth comes out. The battlefield does not belong only to the living. One soldier, his voice trembling decades after his service, put it best: "We thought we were alone out there fighting men. But we weren't alone. Something else was watching. And it wasn't human." The winter of 1943 on the Eastern Front was not just a battle against the German army, it was a battle against the very land itself. The frozen forests of Smolensk swallowed entire divisions, and soldiers spoke of nights when even the wolves refused to howl. It was there, among the snow-choked trenches, that Soviet infantrymen reported encounters so strange they dared not write them in their journals. At 2 a.m., during a lull in fighting, a squad stationed on the edge of the forest claimed they saw lanterns weaving between the trees. At first, they assumed it was a German patrol. But when the figures emerged into the clearing, their shapes were translucent, their uniforms not German at all but centuries out of date. Long coats, plumed helmets, rifles that belonged to a war long forgotten. The apparitions passed silently through the snow, leaving no footprints. Yet, as they disappeared, one soldier swore he felt a cold hand grip his shoulder, and he screamed so loudly the entire trench awoke. The next morning, that same soldier was found unresponsive, his skin clammy, his eyes staring blankly at nothing. He never spoke again. On the other side of the world, in the steaming jungles of Papua New Guinea, Allied soldiers encountered something equally unsettling. In 1942, an Australian patrol advancing through thick undergrowth described stumbling upon a clearing filled with mist that seemed to glow faintly. Inside the haze, they saw silhouettes of men, dozens of them, standing perfectly still. When the patrol leader shouted for identification, the figures dissolved into the mist, leaving behind a stench of rotting meat so powerful that several men vomited. The strange fog lingered for hours, and when it finally cleared, they discovered bones half buried in the soil, not from recent fighting but ancient, brittle remains. Locals later told them the land was cursed, a place where the restless dead gathered to watch the living repeat their mistakes. Even in peacekeeping missions, the unexplainable stalks the men in uniform. In 1994, during the UN's deployment in Rwanda, a group of blue helmets stationed outside Kigali reported hearing chanting in the night. It echoed from the hills, low and rhythmic, growing louder until it seemed to surround the camp. The men raised their weapons, expecting an ambush. But when they scanned the ridgelines with night vision scopes, they saw nothing. No heat signatures, no movement. Still, the chanting grew until one soldier collapsed, clutching his head, screaming that the voices were inside his skull. Just as suddenly as it began, the sound ceased. The next morning, the surrounding villagers swore they had heard nothing at all. To this day, veterans of that mission describe the incident as more terrifying than any firefight. In Iraq, 2007, an American patrol in Diyala province reported an encounter that shook even the most battle-hardened among them. While moving through a bombed-out village, the men entered a school building reduced to rubble. On the chalkboard, scrawled in faint white, were words in English, "Don't look behind you." Thinking it a cruel joke left by insurgents, the squad laughed nervously. But moments later, one man screamed, spinning around and firing his weapon into the shadows. He swore he had seen a figure standing just inches behind him, tall, faceless, cloaked in black. No one else saw it, yet every man in the squad admitted to feeling a crushing weight in the room, as if invisible eyes were pressing against them. When they left, the words on the chalkboard were gone. The pattern is unmistakable. In every conflict, no matter the geography, no matter the decade, soldiers describe being stalked by forces that defy reason. Sometimes they take the form of the past, ancient warriors marching silently across modern battlefields. Sometimes they are lights or voices, or figures that slip just out of sight. And sometimes they are warnings, cryptic and cruel, arriving moments before death itself. One of the most chilling testimonies comes from Sierra Leone in the late 1990s. UN peacekeepers stationed near Freetown spoke of nights when the jungle came alive with children's laughter. It would drift through the trees, light and playful, until it turned into screaming. When the men pushed into the bush with flashlights, they found nothing, only claw-like marks etched into the bark of trees, too high for any child to reach. Some of the locals whispered that the laughter belonged to the lost children, spirits of those killed during the Civil War, wandering the jungle in eternal play. Others believed it was something far older, something that fed on fear. These encounters leave scars deeper than any bullet wound. Veterans describe them years, even decades later, their voices shaking, their eyes darting as if the memories still circle the room. The battlefield takes their comrades, their innocence, sometimes their sanity. But these encounters take something even greater. The certainty that the world is knowable, that danger can always be faced with steel and fire. Because how do you fight what you cannot see? How do you survive an enemy that exists only in the space between reason and nightmare? And so, across wars, across generations, a silent truth binds soldiers together. They are not just warriors. They are witnesses. Witnesses to something watching us from the shadows, something that emerges when the ground is soaked in blood, something that refuses to be forgotten. The war in Afghanistan was brutal in its simplicity: mountains, valleys, caves, ambushes, and silence. But for the men sent into the high passes of Kunar and Nuristan, there were nights when the enemy wasn't Taliban at all. One Marine squad reported entering a cave system in 2009. Inside, their flashlights flickered without cause, beams cutting through dust-filled air. The walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting, though no wind touched their faces. In the deepest chamber, they discovered carvings, not Arabic, not Pashto, but symbols no one recognized. A circle of them stretched across the rock like a ritual, old, scorched, and burned into the stone. As the men examined the markings, the air grew dense and heavy, and a sound unlike anything they had ever heard began to echo. It was not language, not quite. More like a hum, low and metallic, reverberating through the walls. Within seconds, one man collapsed, blood seeping from his nose. The squad dragged him out, and as they stumbled into the night air, they swore they saw figures at the mouth of the cave, tall, elongated, glowing faintly in the moonlight. The figures did not move. By the time reinforcements arrived, the cave was empty, and the markings had vanished. Not all encounters take place in the isolation of mountains. In the ruins of Grozny, during the First Chechen War, Russian soldiers began to whisper about the man in the mask. They claimed that at night, among the bombed-out apartment blocks, a figure walked the rubble. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a featureless white mask that glowed in the dark. Whenever he appeared, artillery would fall within minutes, as if he was marking the buildings for destruction. One platoon swore they tried to chase him, following his silhouette across shattered courtyards, but each time he turned a corner he was gone. Days later, every man in that platoon was killed in a single shelling. Survivors from nearby units still insist the man in the mask was not flesh and blood but something summoned by war itself, an omen that death was coming. Stranger still are the reports that echo across oceans and decades. In the South Pacific, U.S. Navy sailors during training exercises in 1985 described encountering a ghost ship. Radar picked up a large, slow-moving vessel drifting just outside the fleet. The destroyer USS Fletcher was dispatched to intercept. As they approached, the sailors saw an old warship rusting, its deck broken, lifeboats missing. No flag, no signal. Yet through their binoculars, they swore they could see figures moving on the deck, frozen in the act of work, coiling ropes, manning posts, standing watch. The Fletcher hailed the vessel repeatedly. No answer. When they closed within a mile, the ship dissolved. Gone. The ocean was empty. And yet the radar still tracked it, moving steadily until it drifted beyond range and disappeared. Even training grounds far from combat are not immune. In the Nevada desert, during nighttime drills, U.S. Army recruits at Fort Irwin reported being followed by phantom lights. These were orbs, red and white, moving silently across the sand dunes, always just at the edge of vision. At first, the instructors believed they were flares or misidentified aircraft. But the recruits swore they could feel heat radiating from them like standing near a fire. On one night, the lights approached within 20 meters, hovering above the ground. Several soldiers reported seeing faces inside them, faces twisted in anguish, screaming soundlessly. And then just as quickly the lights winked out, leaving the desert in silence. The Army dismissed the incident as nerves and exhaustion, but the recruits never forgot. There are encounters that defy even the imagination of hardened veterans. In 1976, during joint NATO exercises in Norway, a group of British commandos bivouacked near a frozen lake. At 3 a.m., they awoke to the sound of cracking ice. Thinking the lake was breaking up, they rushed outside. What they saw instead left them paralyzed. In the middle of the frozen expanse stood a column of figures, pale blue, glowing faintly as if lit from within. They were arranged in perfect formation, like a battalion at rest, their outlines blurred by frost. The commandos stared as the figures turned their heads in unison, facing the men on the shore. And then, without a sound, they sank into the ice and vanished. The next day, locals told them the lake was cursed, that centuries ago, an entire regiment of mercenaries had drowned there, their bodies never recovered. It is in these stories that a pattern begins to emerge. Not just ghosts, not just shadows, but a kind of mirror. Soldiers see soldiers. The dead meet the living on the same battlefields, as though war itself carves a wound in time, pulling men from one century into another. Some encounters terrify with their violence, others with their silence, but all of them suggest the same thing, that on battlefields death is never truly gone. It lingers, watching, waiting, reminding the living that they walk on ground already claimed. And yet, the strangest stories are not about apparitions or voices but about warnings. In Korea, during the winter of 1951, an American patrol in the mountains swore they heard someone calling their names in perfect English. The voices echoed from the ridge, urgent, panicked, screaming for them to turn back. The men hesitated. Minutes later, a mortar strike obliterated the path ahead, where they would have been walking. They survived only because of the voices. No one ever saw the source, and no one ever explained how the unseen knew their names. It is here in these warnings that the mystery deepens. Who are the watchers in the shadows of war? Are they the dead trying to protect the living, or something far stranger, something that feeds on human fear but spares its prey for reasons unknown? Soldiers return from battlefields scarred by memories of blood and fire. But some return with questions that have no answers, questions that linger long after the guns fall silent, haunting them for the rest of their lives. There are nights when war seems to stop breathing, when even the distant artillery pauses, and silence falls heavier than any explosion. In Vietnam, several U.S. soldiers spoke of such nights in the jungles near the A Shau Valley. Patrols would move through the thick undergrowth only to discover that the usual chorus of frogs, insects, and birds had gone completely still. One Marine recalled glancing at his watch. It read 2:11 a.m., when suddenly the jungle around them shifted. The trees seemed taller, denser, as though they had stepped into a different forest entirely. Ahead on the trail, they saw figures in unfamiliar uniforms, faded and torn, their rifles slung across their shoulders. At first the men thought they had stumbled onto Viet Cong fighters, but as their eyes adjusted they realized the uniforms were American. World War II issue, long outdated. The figures didn't notice them, didn't move naturally. They marched silently, their boots not disturbing a single leaf, their eyes blank, staring ahead. Then, as the Marines raised their weapons, the column dissolved into mist, leaving the trail empty once more. Far from the jungles, in the frozen tundra of Siberia, Soviet border guards reported another kind of silence. In the winter of 1983, stationed near the Amur River, a small outpost picked up faint signals on their field radios, voices whispering in German, calling out coordinates. The guards assumed it was interference, perhaps leftover broadcasts bouncing from the atmosphere. But when they triangulated the signal, it pointed to a patch of barren snow only a few kilometers away. A patrol was sent. Under the pale moonlight, they found the remnants of a destroyed encampment, charred wood, rusted helmets, the insignia of the Wehrmacht half buried in ice. Yet no German troops had set foot in Siberia during the war, not officially. The strangest detail, the snow around the ruins was fresh, yet the wood smoldered as though it had burned only hours earlier. There are stories too of skies that open in ways no pilot can explain. During the Gulf War, American fighter crews flying over Iraq described sudden bursts of light, like flares, that appeared at impossible altitudes. One F-15 pilot reported chasing what he believed to be an enemy aircraft, only to watch it dart vertically into the upper atmosphere without acceleration limits. His radar confirmed the contact, his wingman saw it too, but the object vanished as quickly as it appeared. After landing, the pilot was told to keep quiet. Yet he admitted later that what unsettled him most wasn't the speed of the craft, but the strange hum that filled his cockpit as he pursued it, like thousands of voices layered together in a single unending note. But perhaps the most chilling testimonies come not from the skies, nor the jungles, but the trenches where men fought face to face. In Iraq in 2004, a unit of soldiers in Fallujah described being pinned down in a darkened alley, bullets ricocheting off the walls. Suddenly the gunfire stopped. From the far end of the alley, a man walked calmly toward them. He was tall, wearing tattered robes, his face hidden beneath a hood. The soldiers shouted, demanded he stop, but he did not. Their night vision scopes captured him perfectly, until he raised his head. His face was pale, featureless, blank skin where eyes and mouth should have been. Terror froze the squad. They opened fire. The bullets struck walls, shattered windows, tore into the dust. But when the smoke cleared, the alley was empty. The hooded figure had vanished. In every war, there are stories of such watchers. Sometimes they warn, sometimes they terrify, but always they vanish without leaving a trace. Yet in some cases, they leave behind something undeniable. In Bosnia in the 1990s, peacekeepers stumbled into a burned-out farmhouse while conducting routine sweeps. Inside, they found photographs scattered across the floor, blackened by fire. In each photo, families posed, soldiers smiled, children laughed. But in the corner of nearly every image stood a shadow, a faint outline of a tall figure with no face. Locals swore the farmhouse had been abandoned for decades, long before the war. And yet the photos were fresh, the colors not yet faded, the paper unstained by age. Stories travel across borders, whispered from one soldier to another like warnings passed in secret. In 2010, during patrols near the Korangal Valley, American soldiers swapped tales with Afghan villagers who spoke of the whistlers, beings that roamed the mountains at night, their voices rising like flutes on the wind. The soldiers laughed, dismissing it as folklore. But one night, while setting up an observation post, they heard it. A sound too sharp to be the wind, too rhythmic to be chance. A high-pitched whistle circling their camp. As they strained to listen, they realized the whistles were repeating, mimicking the words of their own conversations from earlier in the night, word for word, in perfect English. The next morning, when they swept the perimeter, they found no footprints, no sign of an enemy, only the echo of the whistles still ringing in their heads. There is a sense that these encounters are not random, that they follow soldiers like shadows, appearing at moments of fear, exhaustion, or imminent death. Veterans often describe them years later in hushed tones, voices cracking with the weight of memory. Some speak of them as omens, others as guardians, still others as predators. But all agree on one thing. In the heat of war, when life and death hang by a thread, the line between the natural and the unexplainable begins to dissolve. And when it does, soldiers glimpse a reality that refuses to be forgotten. The deeper you move into the testimonies of soldiers, the more it feels like a hidden archive of war, a catalog of things that should not exist, yet keep surfacing wherever men fight. By the time the 20th century bled into the 21st, these encounters had spread across every battlefield, from jungles and deserts to frozen mountains, each story carrying the same unsettling weight, the same sense of being watched by something that does not belong to our world. In 2008, a small squad of British troops was patrolling the outskirts of Helmand province. The night was cold, the moon veiled by clouds, and every sound echoed too loudly in the barren silence. At 3:17 a.m., one of the soldiers spotted movement on the thermal scope. A lone figure stood on the ridge, tall, thin, unmoving. The squad assumed it was a Taliban scout and prepared to advance. But when they checked again, the figure was gone. The patrol moved cautiously forward, only to find a shallow trench, its walls carved in strange spiral patterns, symbols no one could identify. In the center lay a rusted Lee Enfield rifle, World War II era, impossible to be there. When they returned to base and logged the discovery, the rifle had vanished from their evidence locker by morning. Half a world away, American soldiers in Iraq had their own share of midnight horrors. In 2005, near Mosul, a convoy halted when their lead Humvee broke down. The men stepped out, scanning the horizon. That's when they heard it, footsteps, dozens of them crunching across the sand, but no one was visible. The sound circled them, drawing closer, until one soldier swore he saw faint shapes forming in the dust, outlines of men with bayonets fixed, advancing in silence. The convoy opened fire into the darkness, tracer rounds illuminating nothing but the desert. Yet in the chaos, one soldier's helmet cam captured a split-second image, a row of shadowy figures rushing past, then dissolving like smoke. The footage was confiscated within hours, never to be seen again. Not all encounters were violent. In 1991, during Operation Desert Storm, a group of Marines digging fighting positions in Kuwait described being visited by what they called the Man in White. Exhausted and half delirious from dehydration, they watched as a robed figure appeared on the horizon and walked calmly toward them. The man carried no weapon, no gear, and when he reached the trench, he simply stood, looking down at the soldiers with eyes that reflected light like mirrors. One Marine swore the figure spoke, not in words but in a sound that vibrated inside their skulls, a low hum that filled them with both fear and calm. Moments later, the figure turned and walked away into the sandstorm that was sweeping in. When the storm cleared, there were no footprints. But perhaps the most haunting tales come from the frozen remains of forgotten wars. In Korea, veterans still whisper about the shadows on the ridgeline. At the Battle of Chosin Reservoir in December 1950, temperatures plunged to 40 below zero. Survivors spoke of dark silhouettes that moved against the snow, visible even when enemy fire ceased. Some swore they saw these figures walking upright across minefields without triggering a single explosion. One Marine, half frozen and bleeding, claimed a shadow knelt beside him, shielding him from the wind until morning. When he woke, there was no trace of anyone, but his frostbite had not advanced, and his wounds had miraculously clotted. The Balkans in the 1990s brought another layer of strangeness. Peacekeepers in Kosovo stumbled upon abandoned villages where houses seemed frozen midlife, food still warm on stoves, clothes hanging half-folded, doors wide open, but not a single soul inside. More chilling were the reports of ghostly lights flickering through the woods at night. One patrol followed the lights, believing them to be fleeing civilians. Instead, they found a field littered with rusted tanks, their metal carcasses decades old, and standing among them, a boy no older than 12. He stared silently, then lifted a hand as though to wave. The soldiers shouted, but in that instant, the boy dissolved into the air, and the tanks crumbled into dust before their eyes, leaving only a barren clearing. The deeper the accounts go, the less they seem tied to geography or culture. In Afghanistan, Iraq, Vietnam, Korea, Siberia, Bosnia, the encounters follow the same script. Time slips. Figures appear in outdated uniforms. Voices echo where no one should be. And always, the soldiers come back changed, carrying a memory that gnaws at them long after the battle is over. Many refuse to speak of it. Others write journals that never reach the light of day, found only after their deaths. Some try to dismiss it as hallucination, stress, fatigue. But the details are too consistent, too precise, too numerous across decades and continents to be dismissed so easily. By the early 2010s, these stories had grown into something larger than whispered folklore. Declassified reports began to surface, buried in military archives, hinting that intelligence divisions had taken these testimonies seriously. Files marked with code names, Project Nemesis, Operation Silent Watch, the Night Visitor logs, contained pages of soldier statements, photographs, and in some cases, crude sketches of the entities described. The official line was always the same: unverified, anecdotal, unreliable. And yet, the files were kept, updated, and secured as though they mattered far more than the public was ever allowed to know. The deeper we go into these shadows, the more one question lingers. Are these apparitions echoes of the past, lost souls trapped on battlefields? Are they tricks of the mind born of fear and exhaustion? Or are they something older, something that thrives wherever death walks in numbers too great to comprehend? Whatever they are, soldiers across generations have seen them, heard them, felt their presence. And no matter how much science resists, the testimonies keep piling up, each one more chilling than the last. By the time the wars of the 21st century settled into their endless rotations, the soldiers who had seen the unexplainable carried something far heavier than the weight of combat. Their stories began to take on a pattern so striking it could not be ignored. The accounts were always delivered in hushed voices, often long after discharge, told in dimly lit bars, therapists' offices, or in handwritten letters that surfaced decades later. Each testimony carried that same haunted cadence, the voice of someone who had brushed against a truth too vast, too terrifying to put neatly into words. In the spring of 2009, a detachment of U.S. troops stationed near the Khyber Pass reported what they called the Invisible March. At precisely 2:06 a.m., the sentries on duty heard the rhythmic stomp of boots, hundreds of them, echoing across the valley. The sound was so loud, so precise, that one soldier instinctively shouted, "Company, halt." But the steps continued, closing in, until the earth beneath their boots began to tremble. Night vision goggles revealed nothing. No movement, no heat signatures, only the sound of unseen soldiers advancing toward their position. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the sound stopped. The valley fell into an unnatural silence, so deep it pressed on their eardrums. In the morning, they discovered fresh boot prints, dozens of them, pressed into the dust, each belonging to a type of combat boot that had not been issued since the 1940s. There are testimonies from Africa too, forgotten patrols in Sierra Leone and the Congo where peacekeepers swore they encountered whole columns of phantom soldiers. One South African veteran described a night march in 2002 when his unit followed what appeared to be a group of refugees through the jungle. Lanterns swayed in the distance, faint voices drifted through the trees. When the unit pushed harder to catch up, the lights suddenly scattered like sparks in the wind. The voices faded, leaving the soldiers alone in a clearing that was eerily quiet. The next morning, they stumbled across rotting uniforms half buried in the soil, clothes of soldiers who had fought and died there 30 years earlier. Some of the most terrifying cases come not from the battlefield but from the places soldiers thought were safe. In 1973, during the Yom Kippur War, Israeli troops camped in the Sinai Desert claimed that their mess tent was visited by a stranger late one night. He walked in calmly, dressed in olive fatigues that didn't match any known uniform. His face was gaunt, his eyes strangely reflective. He did not speak, yet every man in the tent later swore they heard his voice inside their head, warning them of an ambush at dawn. When morning came, the unit braced themselves. At 5:42 a.m., Egyptian artillery opened fire on their exact position, but because they had moved at first light, casualties were avoided. The mysterious figure was never seen again. To this day, veterans of that unit still refuse to dismiss it as coincidence. And then there are the Arctic stories, the kind that feel less like ghost tales and more like intrusions from another dimension. In 1952, Canadian soldiers stationed near Alert, one of the northernmost military outposts on Earth, recorded a bizarre incident in their logs. 3 nights in a row, at exactly 11:11 p.m., glowing figures appeared on the horizon. At first they looked like human silhouettes, marching in formation across the ice. But as they drew closer, the men realized the figures were semi-transparent, their movements too fluid, as though they were walking both in and out of this world. The commander ordered flares fired into the sky. The light illuminated nothing, only empty snowdrifts. Yet the men swore they continued to see the figures, even after the flares burned out. By the 4th night, the apparitions vanished, leaving behind only a thin layer of frost on the soldiers' weapons, as though touched by something colder than the Arctic itself. The strangest accounts often revolve around time. Soldiers claim to see battles that already happened, scenes unfolding like a film projected across reality. In Vietnam, some patrols described witnessing entire platoons moving silently through the jungle, only to realize the uniforms were from the French Indochina War of the 1940s. In one chilling case, an American sergeant attempted to call out to a ghostly soldier he saw limping through the undergrowth. The figure stopped, looked directly at him, and mouthed a single word, "Run." Moments later, the sergeant's unit came under ambush. Without that warning, none of them would have survived. And yet, the most disturbing stories are not the ones where soldiers see the dead, but the ones where something entirely unknown makes itself known. In Afghanistan's Karangal Valley, a U.S. squad on night patrol reported seeing a creature crouched on a ridge. It was massive, easily over 7 feet tall, its eyes burning faintly red in the darkness. At first, they assumed it was an enemy fighter using night vision gear, but when they raised their rifles, the creature unfolded itself and moved in a blur, faster than any man could run. One soldier fired, swearing he hit the target, but the thing did not fall. Instead, it let out a shriek so high-pitched it rattled their teeth, then vanished into the rocks. The next day, they found claw marks gouged into stone, deeper than any human hand could make. These are the testimonies that never make it to official reports, the stories dismissed as fatigue, hallucination, or stress. But when you line them up across time and continents, they form a pattern too sharp to ignore. There is something that follows war. Something that thrives in blood-soaked soil and fields of death. Soldiers know it. They feel it in their bones, in the way silence sometimes weighs heavier than gunfire, in the way shadows move where they should not. And though science may laugh, the testimonies keep coming, stacking higher, forcing us to ask whether battlefields are simply places of war, or doorways into something far older, far darker than we dare admit. There is a moment at the end of every war when the guns fall silent, the smoke clears, and soldiers return home. Yet for some, the battle never ends. They carry with them not just the memories of blood and fire, but the burden of things they cannot explain. In dim kitchens, in late-night phone calls, in confessions made under the influence of whiskey or morphine, the same whispers emerge, whispers of footsteps without soldiers, of voices that speak warnings from the other side, of beings that watch wars the way men watch games. What is most chilling is not how different these stories are, but how eerily similar. From Korea to Kandahar, from the Ardennes to the deserts of Sinai, the same threads repeat. Apparitions in uniform, battles replayed across decades, creatures stalking the edges of human conflict as if drawn by death itself. One of the most unnerving testimonies came from Iraq in 2006, when a convoy escorting supplies through Fallujah reported seeing a child standing in the middle of the road at 3:11 a.m. He did not move even as the lead Humvee slowed to a halt. His face was pale, his eyes dark and unblinking. When the driver stepped out, the boy vanished into thin air. Minutes later, an IED detonated farther up the road, exactly where the convoy would have been if it had continued. The soldiers swore the child had saved their lives. Yet when they checked local reports, no child had gone missing, no body was ever found. Who or what was standing there that night remains unanswered. Even more disturbing are the accounts that suggest these presences are not simply ghosts of the dead, but something older, something outside the boundaries of time. In 1991, during Operation Desert Storm, a British tank crew claimed to see an entire phalanx of warriors, shields raised, spears gleaming, charging across the desert under a blood-red moon. For a few moments, it was as if they were watching an ancient battle replaying itself on the sands of Kuwait. And then, just as quickly, the vision dissolved into dust. One officer, hardened by decades of service, wrote later in his journal, "It was as though the earth remembered its own wars and chose to remind us that we were not the first to shed blood here." There are stories that slip beyond the ghostly and into the truly inexplicable, reports of time bending, of dimensions folding. In Bosnia, a UN peacekeeper described stepping into a burned-out farmhouse in 1994 and finding himself standing in a room that was impossibly intact. The walls were whole, the air smelled of bread baking, voices echoed from somewhere nearby. Then, in the blink of an eye, the room returned to ruin, its silence broken only by the sound of his own heartbeat. He staggered outside, shaken, and swore never to enter another abandoned building again. And then there is the question that no military, no government, no historian dares to answer aloud. Why do these things cluster around war? Why do the dead rise, the strange appear, the unexplainable surface when men take up arms against each other? Some believe it is the sheer concentration of human suffering, that war itself tears a hole in the fabric of reality, a wound through which other things leak. Others whisper of watchers, beings who are drawn to conflict like moths to flame, feeding on fear, on chaos, on death. Whatever the reason, soldiers know it to be true. They may not admit it in daylight, but when the night grows long and silence falls heavy, the truth comes spilling out. As the decades pass, the testimonies only multiply. They come from young soldiers barely out of training, from veterans with silver in their hair, from men and women who have fought under different flags in different centuries, yet who speak with the same haunted eyes. They describe things that cannot be laughed away, cannot be dismissed as tricks of the mind. And though military files may bury the reports under words like fatigue or hallucination, the voices keep speaking. The pattern keeps growing. The unexplainable keeps returning, as if waiting for the next war to awaken it again. Perhaps that is the final, most terrifying truth. That war does not simply scar the living, it opens doors. And once those doors are open, something always steps through. The soldiers who have seen it know this in their bones. They may never say it on camera, may never testify in official reports, but in their silence lies the heaviest truth of all. The battlefield belongs not just to men, but to shadows, to memories, and to forces science may never understand. And so, as we close this file, we are left with a single haunting certainty. Wherever men march to war, something else marches beside them, watching, waiting, and reminding us that in the theater of battle, humanity is never truly alone. The silence that follows these stories is often the loudest part. Veterans who carried rifles across jungles, deserts, and frozen forests will sometimes pause mid-sentence, eyes unfocused, as if reliving something that words cannot fully capture. It is in that silence that the weight of the unexplainable lingers, an echo that never quite fades. For many, the war ended on paper but not in memory. The wars within, the ones that involved shadows walking among the living, or voices that came from nowhere, continued long after the medals were polished and the uniforms folded away. Even the most skeptical commanders have admitted, off record, that there were reports which never made it into official archives. An Air Force officer once confessed that during the Gulf War, radar operators frequently detected shapes moving above the desert skies at impossible speeds. Orders came down to ignore them, to call them glitches and atmospheric anomalies. Yet the men watching the screens knew these were not mechanical errors. They were movements with intelligence, as though something watched the battles from the sky, unseen and unchallenged. What unnerved them most was the feeling that the objects were not foreign aircraft but something outside the realm of nations, a presence indifferent to human borders and flags. In Afghanistan, a young American soldier spoke of hearing music in the mountains near Kunar province. Ancient flutes echoing through the valleys at 2 a.m., melodies that none of his unit could explain. The sounds were recorded, played back, and studied. Experts dismissed them as shepherd songs drifting on the wind. But when the soldier returned home, he began to dream of figures cloaked in dust, carrying instruments that shimmered like bone. He swore the same melody haunted him in his sleep for years, until one night he awoke to find his radio, unplugged and unpowered, playing that same eerie tune in the dark. These accounts are not isolated. They stretch like a thread through generations of warfare. A French officer from World War I wrote of phantom regiments seen marching across no man's land at dawn, only to vanish when artillery fire lit the horizon. A Soviet soldier in 1944 described hearing the sound of church bells in a forest that had no village, no church, nothing but shattered trees and snow. In every corner of conflict, there are whispers of the inexplicable, of things that slip through reality when men are too busy killing each other to notice. What chills the soul is not only the presence of these forces but the patterns they follow. They appear at the edges of bloodshed, at the turning points of battles, at the hours when fear and exhaustion grip soldiers most tightly. It is as though war itself creates a beacon, summoning the strange and the spectral to gather where human suffering is most intense. Some believe they are guardians, intervening to protect men from worse fates. Others suspect they are predators, feeding on fear, despair, and the energy of the dying. Either way, soldiers agree on one thing. When you feel the air turn heavy, when you hear footsteps that do not belong, when the battlefield grows unnaturally still, you know you are no longer fighting alone. And so these stories endure, whispered from foxholes to barracks, from mess halls to hospital wards. They form a hidden chronicle of war, one never found in history books, but carved into the memories of those who lived it. They are reminders that the battlefield is not only a place of human conflict but a stage shared with forces we may never fully understand. As long as war exists, so too will these shadows. And those who march to war tomorrow may find themselves walking the same haunted paths, under the same watchful eyes as their brothers and sisters did before them. Because in the end, the battlefield is not just a theater of nations. It is a crossing point, a place where life, death, and something far older meet. And every soldier who has stepped into that crucible knows the same truth, whether they speak it aloud or not. War awakens things that cannot be explained, and once awakened, they never truly go back to sleep. And so, as the last echoes of these testimonies fade into the darkness, one question remains: what really walks beside the soldier when the night grows still, when the world of men collapses into fire and silence? Are these visions fragments of shattered minds, or are they visitors from a realm that feeds on the blood and terror of war? The generals may bury the reports, the archives may classify the files, but the truth does not die so easily. It lingers in the eyes of the veterans who can't forget, in the trembling voices of those who finally speak, in the patterns that repeat across every battlefield in history. Perhaps war is more than a clash of armies. It is a ritual, and something ancient always answers the call. This is War Files Uncovered, where we drag into the light the secrets nations would rather leave buried, where every whisper and every shadow has a place in the story of mankind's darkest hours. If you have felt that chill, if you want to see the files they never wanted you to see, then stay with us. Subscribe, because the next war file we open may be darker than anything you've heard tonight, and its truth may be waiting closer than you think.